Hello and welcome to Lesson 7, Human Memory, Eyewitness Testimony and Anxiety. Psychologists have long understood that there is a complex relationship between anxiety and memory. Anyone who's ever sat an exam, for example, and has drawn a blank will know that this is a complex relationship. Sometimes anxiety seems to boost us to the point of optimum performance, and at other times it seems to floor us. Well, this is equally true for eyewitness testimony. So here are the guide note questions that we'll start the next lesson off with. Please have a look at these beforehand and make sure you have some answers for them. Okay, the first study we're going to look at is Johnson and Scott in 1976. Now, this one is sometimes quite difficult in the literature. Sometimes it's actually attributed to Elizabeth Loftus. So if you're reading a textbook that says this is Loftus's study, it's not quite right. What happened was Johnson and Scott were presenting this at a conference and Loftus reported on it. As a result, it's sometimes been falsely attributed to her. Either way, it's a very clever study. Participants were outside a waiting room and they would hear or overhear an argument in condition 1, or other participants would hear a gentle discussion about machinery. Afterwards, a Confederate would emerge. Obviously, they didn't know they were a Confederate, and the participants would have witnessed one of two conditions. The Confederate would have been covered in blood or grease, and the Confederate would be carrying a letter opener or a pen. These two conditions effectively create both conditions of an independent group's design. When they asked them to pick the suspect out of a lineup, later on, 33% of the participants in the high anxiety condition, that's the blood and letter opener, could correctly identify him. However, 49% in the low anxiety group could also identify him. Now, because low anxiety in this case is correlated with higher accuracy of memory, it was argued that the reason why these high anxiety group individuals found it difficult was because of the weapon effect. They suggested that the anxiety of seeing the blood and the letter opener was so overwhelming that it impaired memory of that event, whereas the non-aggressive and relatively low anxiety group would have had an accurate memory of that, not dealing with anxiety at the same time. Now, there are some limitations to this study, as you can imagine. It's an artificial task. People are waiting to take part in an experiment. Someone comes out, you might start thinking something's up. You're probably a bit more savvy to psychology experiments anyway. The other thing is consequentiality, the degree to which it actually have real-world consequences may be questioned. Expectation, as we sort of hinted at just previously. You may expect something to happen, which is not often the case. Though you could argue, perhaps not, you're in a waiting situation. And there are contradictory studies, which we'll look at in a moment. So, Pickle criticises this study. When they carried out a similar study, they had a thief, and the thief walked through a hairdressing salon. And they were either carrying scissors, handgun, or a raw chicken. So they categorise these as being high surprise and low surprise, and high anxiety and low anxiety, with scissors fairly low surprise in a hairdressing environment, but high anxiety in the hands of a thief. A handgun, high anxiety produced, but you're less likely to see one of those, so high surprise as well. And then the raw chicken, low anxiety but high surprise. So what they actually found was that participants struggled to recall the raw chicken condition and not the gun condition, as you might expect from Johnson and Scott. Pickle argued that actually what impaired the memory of that event was the novelty of that condition. In other words, you don't expect to see it. And this could have links to schema theory if you think about it. A robber running away from a bank with a gun in his hand is a schema that we probably already have, and if we experience it, we just access that schema. It's a bit of a shortcut to memory. Whereas a robber running away with a raw chicken, we don't have a schema for. And therefore, that requires a lot more, perhaps, attention and a lot more resources to generate that memory almost from scratch. So there could be a link here with schema theory. One issue that we've always got when we're looking at these sort of laboratory studies is the degree to which we have realism or control, and you rarely have both. So Halford and Milne, for example, they found victims of violent crime were better at recall than victims of non-violent crime. And these were real victims, so this has high realism, but low control, because obviously these are real crimes. And Christensen and Hubernetti also found a similar pattern. Better recall for those directly threatened in robberies compared to those who witnessed it from perhaps some distance. These are two natural experiments that seem to show the opposite to Johnson and Scott's study. So maybe there's a difference between whether or not we experience anxiety in a laboratory setting compared to a real setting. And this would suggest Pickle might be onto something when it comes to the variables that influence this area. Bothwell suggested personality traits may also influence it. If anxiety affects us and our recall, well, not everyone experiences anxiety in the same way, and personality is a huge factor in how much anxiety you experience, or I should say the salience of the anxiety. So people who are neurotic tend to score quite high, so relatively minor events cause them anxiety. People who are extrovert tend to experience less anxiety from unexpected events. So we might expect to see this, and Bothwell argued that that was indeed the case, that neurotics experience high levels of anxiety, arguably, but that this had an impact on their accuracy. In other words, accuracy went down. Fazey and Hardy are also critical of this idea that we have this gentle decline in accuracy. They argue that anxiety can cause catastrophic decline, and that's why, for example, you go into the exam and you have a complete blank. It's not that you recall 10% less than you would normally, it's that you've got nothing, and this would be a sort of catastrophic example. Dieffenbacher contradicts this and argues the opposite. It says that anxiety is like an inverted U. So what's happening is your anxiety goes up and your performance goes up to a point and then down all the way as a result. So you get this sort of peak anxiety, which is ideal for certain things like revision and stuff. If you go beyond that, then it becomes a problem. Of course, that might be contradicted by studies such as Halford and Milne. Realism and control, just a little side here. Generally in studies, when we increase control, we reduce realism. So if it's a laboratory study, we have high control, but low realism. If it's a natural experiment, we have high realism, but low control. There's always a balance and a trade-off. And as a scientist, I tend to favour control over realism. However, if the reproducibility project has taught us anything, it's that there is a crisis in psychology when it comes to valid results. So maybe we have been focusing a little too much on control and not enough on realism. How might we explain this? Well, state and context-dependent forgetting, which we looked at under forgetting, badly suggests that when you reinstate the context of an environment, when you recall something in the same environment you learn it, that can boost recall rates. For most crimes, we want to be as far away, if we're victims, we want to be as far away as possible from the crime scene. We don't want to go back there. We don't want to put ourselves back in that environment. So actually, it could be that we're being asked to recall an event in a different location, which is hampering memory to a small amount. Goodwin may actually provide a slightly stronger piece of evidence here, and that's the idea that our internal state actually has an important role to play. In other words, if you're high anxiety when you experience something like a crime, then Goodwin argues that you should be in that same state if you want to recall accurately. Obviously, we cannot put victims back into that state, but the closer they are, the higher recall there may be. So maybe the reason why such a decline when you have high anxiety, like Johnson and Scott study, is that later on you are no longer suffering from anxiety, and therefore you're recalling it. You could argue in real world situations that the anxiety is so severe from real crimes that maybe that has an impact. So it could explain the relationship between anxiety and memory. Just a few implications from the research. One is that the justice system is particularly aware of this now, whereas back in the 70s this was new research and very few prosecutors, defense attorneys or lawyers and judges would have been aware of this research. They now know the effect anxiety can have on eyewitness testimony, and most of them do. And this is especially salient for certain crimes. You think about sexual crimes and violent crimes. These are highly intensely emotional events that people experience. So it's really important to understand this complex relationship with anxiety and crime. Practical applications, obviously training, legal stuff, you can use this stuff to make them more effective lawyers, more effective police officers, cognitive interview, which we'll look at next time, and of course improving exam technique. So that is anxiety and eyewitness testimony. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, as always, come and find me. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. Bye bye.